Hello, everyone. My name is Mitchell Girling. I'm a student with the Alberta School of Business, and this is my certificate in sustainability integrative capstone project. My project is Indigenous sustainability values in business, and it was a case study of Indigenous businesses in Canada. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwa, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. The case study methodology and the process that I used throughout this was to examine and define business sustainability, sustainability, and Indigenous business. From there, I was able to establish clear criteria to select relevant Indigenous businesses in Canada. I selected 4 Indigenous businesses, and then I applied certain criteria in order to provide an in-depth analysis of these companies. The project outline follows some research components, which provided some definitions and some academic resources about Indigenous business, sustainability, and definitions of those. From there, I moved into the case study, and then I was able to extrapolate from there some lessons of sustainability from Indigenous business, a new business focused definition of Indigenous sustainability, and a framework to support Indigenous business in Canada. Starting off with sustainability in business, I wanted to bring up this quote that it is apparent that there is profound confusion about what constitutes environmental or social responsibility. The typical definition of sustainability within a context of business manages the triple bottom line. It's a process by which firms manage their financial, social, and environmental risks, obligations, and opportunities. It's also known as people, planet, and profits. It mostly focuses on the economic and environmental components of sustainability, and the practices it employs typically involves ESG metrics, CSR standards, ISO standards, triple bottom line, and emissions reporting. But there's stuff missing from this definition. There's no accountability or ownership over the issues that we're facing. There's no collective engagement over the plight of our planet. There's very individualistic survival mentality that prevails. No clear property rights. It's not my problem, is sort of how it feels. There's a lack of personal identification with the problems. There's no emphasis on the social pillar of sustainability. At the end of the day, climate change is human cause. So, how do we make a solution that is human cause? There's limited focus on rectifying past mistakes. It has a mentality of let's do better in the future. From there, we looked into the definition of social entrepreneurship. Social entrepreneurship is a new topic in entrepreneurship that's being practiced. It mainly focuses on these 4 categories: social impact, that is measurable and identifiable, that's surrounding this focal social issue that it's trying to fix. Scale can be determined. Enterprises typically aren't localized. There's a lot of innovation by identifying failing markets and outlining and defining the desired outcome from the business operations. And profits are often reinvested in order to establish lasting impact. Now we looked at a sustainability definition from the Indigenous people of Canada. The Indigenous people of Canada have a sacred legal obligation and responsibility to their ancestors and current and future generations. They protect, defend, and steward the water, land, air, and resources of their territory. They work to maintain and restore conditions that provide the environmental, cultural, spiritual, and economic foundation for their nation and community to thrive. And they assert and exercise their stewardship and governance rights. Broken down, Indigenous sustainability can be seen through the following 6 main components: protection, rights, identity, responsibility, governance, and restoration. From there, we can look at Indigenous business. Robert Anderson proposed some Indigenous approaches to economic development through his research, a collective approach centered on the individual First Nation for the purposes of economic self-sufficiency as a necessary condition for self-government. There was an emphasis on improvement of socioeconomic circumstances and the preservation and strengthening of traditional cultures, values, and languages. These involve the following processes: create and own businesses to exercise control, create businesses that can compete profitably, form alliances and joint ventures, and build the capacity. As we've seen, there's an increase in the rate of GDP growth translates to a direct 1-for-1 increase in the rate of growth of the average incomes of the poorest 40%, of which we see in many Indigenous communities in Canada. We also look at how Indigenous social enterprises can be categorized. We really want to break it down so that we can understand the different groupings of these businesses. There's businesses that serve Indigenous clients, ones that don't serve, that serve non-Indigenous clients, and then companies that are led by Indigenous individuals or companies led by non-Indigenous individuals. Listening to and applying Indigenous voices to these discussions will assist in our consideration of sustainability and environmental justice. And from here, we can sort of break down Indigenous entrepreneurship into three components. That is community, self-reliance, and traditional cultures and values. Indigenous entrepreneurship is a valuable concept. However, it hasn't quite focused on the concept of sustainability. This is an additional building block added to these topics discussed before. Increases in Indigenous entrepreneurship by support and investment can promote self-reliant and self-governing business activities and systems, allowing for an increase in the economic development of these nations and communities. This has a national benefit by reducing poverty through the increase of socioeconomic circumstances, which enables and empowers Indigenous peoples to participate more heavily in national and global markets, which benefits the federal and international governments and economies. Self-reliant businesses and entrepreneurial ecosystems are key to supporting and uplifting Indigenous communities. After all this research, we were able to establish a selection criteria for some businesses. It needed to be primarily owned by Indigenous people and Indigenous communities. It needed to attempt to address a market failure based on some social factor. The founding and operations of the company had to take place within Canadian borders, and their operations need to be generally poised within certain industries that allowed for sustainable analysis. Retail businesses, online stores, wellness centers. From there, we also created some case study analysis criteria. So once we picked the businesses, we looked at them by examining the adoption of a focal social issue, their financial or social reach, their self-reported business mission, their business context, and the presence of ESG metrics or other sustainability standards. We picked 4 businesses: Oasis Boutique, Red Rebel Armor, Birch Bar Coffee Company, and Agritech North. Agritech North was a produce supplier in Ontario. Their social issue was focused around food insecurity and sustainability. They were able to provide food year-round by growing it at their facilities, and they supplied it to much of northwestern Ontario. Their business mission was being a social enterprise or a beneficial corporation. They operated in that produce area, and they had that B Corp certification and a lot of water reduction reporting. And the company itself was operated and owned by Indigenous people in that area. Oasis Boutique really focused on Indigenous cultural revitalization and promotion. They had a lot of awards listed on their website, and they declared that they donated $60,000 to their community. Their fashion lines were specifically Indigenously inspired, and they had a lot of Indigenous designs involved with that stuff, their work. Red Rebel Armor was a streetwear brand that focused on recidivism reduction. They had an expansive online store, and they shared many stories on their website about resilience. They were a clothing brand, and they provided eco-friendly packaging. Birch Bark Coffee Company focused on water advisories. They even outgrew their initial coffee roaster and paired with a new roaster. They had an Indigenous-focused workforce in order to produce their ethically sourced coffee beans, and they had certified fair trade coffee. All right, so from the analysis of the various Indigenous businesses in Canada, we pulled some key takeaways out from that conversation and cross-referenced them with some academic research and came up with the following sort of information that sort of informs us about this topic. So we can see that a larger pool of stakeholders should affect companies. We need to see a broader consideration for community. Resources and skills training need to be provided for Indigenous citizens at a broader scale, better education for them. There needs to be a bigger cultural emphasis on management design, using stories within the business context to explain and assist in designing the company. Community-specific business needs to be promoted with an emphasis on community benefits or fixing social disequilibriums via business. And personal or cultural identity needs to come through within the work product or workplace identity. What does this teach us? Businesses need to cast a wider net when uncovering their stakeholders. They might be better served should they consider the wider range of stakeholders in their business. including communities and Indigenous peoples. Social entrepreneurship and social missions are on the rise. Some established firms may benefit from increasing their social impact to benefit inequities and bolster strength and support within their community. Governments need to continue to support the education of Indigenous peoples while also increasing their access to other resources and skill development opportunities. Firms should also consider cultural aspects in the design of their organization. A company culture of diversity should be emphasized, and forcing employees to fit the status quo of the workplace culture should be abandoned. From there, we have some lessons for Indigenous sustainability in business, going back to that earlier definition. Business needs to fight to protect identities, stories, the environment, and cultures. Governments need to empower and allow Indigenous communities to exercise their rights via business. We need to allow identities and cultures to permeate the business context via diversity. We need to take ownership of our communities and the issues facing them. We need to encourage self reliance of Indigenous businesses. And we need to use businesses to solve problems, but also profits in order to restore our environments. That earlier definition of sustainability was fantastic, and we wanted to look at it again. But we wanted to look at it through a business lens. We need to understand and support the idea that Indigenous people have a sacred legal obligation and responsibility to their ancestors and current and future generations. We need to understand that. We need to support Indigenous people in their process of protecting, defending, and stewarding the water, land, air, and resources of their territory. This can be done via business operations. We need to work to restore broken systems and engage in restorative actions for the environment, for the environmental, economic, social, and cultural aspects of the community. We need to allow Indigenous peoples to assert and exercise their stewardship and government's rights. And then Indigenous values and identities need to come to the forefront of business missions when applicable. From all this information, we cannot assume, nor can we ever expect Indigenous communities and peoples will ever play by the rules of the game. These rules propagate Western, white, and capitalist values and agendas. Thus, we must separate these concepts. Indigenous communities must be supported by the Canadian government and the Canadian economy to conduct business on a self-sufficient basis. To some capacity, they need to operate separately from other Canadian businesses, and their expectation should not be to scale their operations to serve all Canadians, but rather exist primarily to serve their communities. The metrics of success and financial sustainability must be redefined. At the end of the day, Indigenous entrepreneurship itself is unique. Therefore, there needs to be a more curated approach to designing support systems for these businesses. We can recommend the following. Business resources need to be offered locally or via alternative online sources for Indigenous communities. There needs to be investments in business, in communities, and in cultural protection. There needs to be support and a promotion of the existence of these companies for broader investment opportunities. Indigenous businesses need to network and have opportunities to have staffing support, and there needs to be assistance with navigating legal structures. Indigenous business is essential to the Canadian economy, to the Canadian peoples, and supporting a mission to change sustainability and to change business forever. Thank you. Thank you for listening to my presentation.